We're going to begin this morning with a draft of a confidential Internal Revenue Service legal memo that reveals President Trump's tax returns must be given to Congress unless he asserts executive privilege. The memo obtained by the Washington Post contradicts the Trump administration's justification for denying House Democrats' request for the president's tax returns. Trump has refused to turn over 6 years of returns, but has not invoked executive privilege. And Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has denied the request, arguing that lawmakers have no legislative purpose for demanding them. However, according to the 10-page IRS memo, the disclosure of tax returns to the committee is mandatory, requiring the secretary to disclose returns and return information requested by the tax writing chairs. It also directly rejects the reason Mnuchin cites for withholding the returns for lawmakers, adding that the only basis their agency's refusal to comply with the committee's subpoena would be the invocation of the doctrine of executive privilege. The IRS told the Post that the memo was prepared last fall when Democrats had made it clear they would seek copies of Trump's tax returns under a 1924 law requiring the Treasury Secretary to provide them to Congress. However, it is unclear who wrote and reviewed the document. The agency says the memo was never forwarded to the Treasury Department. So, Willie, again, more back and forth about Trump's tax returns. I guess the big question here will be, what happens next? Does this memo mean something actually has to happen?
Right. Does Steve Mnuchin have to respond to this in some way? Let's bring in one of the reporters behind posting this document, economic policy reporter for the Washington Post, Jeff Stein. Jeff, good morning. It's good to have you with us. So let's talk through this a little bit. This memo was written, you all report, in the fall at IRS by a lawyer, but never made it to Treasury Department. Is it fair to say that Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin was not aware of the memo and didn't know about this policy?
That is what the Treasury Department told us in a statement, that Mnuchin never reviewed the memo. We're going to try to get to the bottom of that. Mnuchin is testifying on the Hill today, and I am very confident that lawmakers will try to press him and ask that very question that you just posed, which is a good one.
So is this, Jeff, binding in any way? In other words, is this just an opinion written by a lawyer, or is this an IRS policy that will have implications for, say, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin responding to a subpoena from a congressional committee to get these tax returns out?
No, Mnuchin is not bound by this decision or this memo at all. He's free to make his own opinion, and he can overrule the judgment of subordinates at the IRS. And to that point, the IRS Commissioner, Charles Rettig, overruled this and has concurred with Mnuchin's decision not to furnish the tax returns. That said, the document that we obtained is almost certain to be used by Democrats in their lawsuit in federal court, seeking to compel the release of Trump's tax returns to them.
Hey, Jake Sherman, how worried do you figure Steve Mnuchin is about this memo, considering that the administration's policy clearly is delay and deny on every aspect of congressional requests?
Yeah, Jeff and Josh's story is terrific because it gives a peek inside an agency that's been that's holding on to documents despite what appears to be a clear language in the statute. But I will say this. All of these things, and this plays into what Mika said at the top about impeachment, all of these document requests or requests for testimony are going to be settled in court. And that's becoming more and more evident. That is the backbone of Nancy Pelosi's strategy when it comes to impeachment, as she talked about with Mika in that interview. All of these issues are going to be resolved by a judge. We saw that last week, and Pelosi this morning is going behind closed doors with her lawmakers to discuss all the successes that they anticipate that they'll have and that they have already had in court. So I think everything until possibly, by the way, the Supreme Court, this could go pretty high because, as we know, right, Trump likes to put things off and likes to take things to the highest authority court-wise, and will probably lodge complaints and ask for appeals and all those things. So I think this is going to be ultimately decided by somebody higher than the IRS or Steve Mnuchin.
Well, this administration brings stonewalling to a whole new level because they just say no. No. and no to everything. So if this does go to the courts, the question is going to be, what will be the timeline, especially if there are so many efforts to try and stop the process along the way? Could this drag out so long that the American people don't get a real-time sense of what's really going on? Let's bring in Professor of Practice and distinguished scholar in residence at New York University School of Law, Bob Bauer. He served as White House counsel to President Obama. So, Bob, thanks for being on the show. The memo says that the only basis the agency's refusal to comply with the committee's subpoena would be the invocation of the doctrine of executive privilege. What would be the grounds for that? And again, can the White House do that and say no? I would think the answer would be yes.
In truth, I'm not sure at all what it means to say that the administration could or the president could invoke executive privilege to prevent the release of the returns. The statute, which, as you pointed out earlier, has been on the books for some time, amended again in 1976, speaks in mandatory terms that the secretary shall furnish the requested information. There are designated congressional committees, and including the chief of staff of the Joint Tax Committee, that has the authority under this statute to request the returns. Congress has made a judgment there. It isn't clear in what context or in what way the president could defeat this mandatory requirement with a claim of privilege. Maybe there are some circumstances around some aspects of the returns that perhaps the IRS has in mind that the president could use the privilege to defeat the disclosure of. I'm certainly not clear at the moment what that would be.
It looks to me, and then I want to get back to Jeff, but it looks to me like there could be so many caveats. And this is an administration that will look for them and seize upon them and stop the process.
Well,
No
one thing I would
question.
just add is that the executive privilege, the executive
Hold on,
privilege.
Jeff. Bob, that's for you first, and then Jeff, I'll go to you. Bob, what do you make about the fact that, I mean, the pattern of this administration is to stymie, to say no, to find a way out. So you've just mentioned that there's so many potential caveats that you don't even know in terms of looking at this process and the law, how the law applies here. Are we looking at months and years before we get anything out of this administration in terms of tax returns or any type of information?
Yes, I mean, I can't speak to each and every instance and how easy it would be for the administration to hold out, but without a doubt, if this all goes to litigation, then absolutely, given the various stages of the appellate process that it could go through, this could consume a significant amount of time well into next year and beyond.
And there you go. Jeff, what happens next then?
It's a big question, and I don't know. I just wanted to make a quick point that, you know, the doctrine of executive privilege is about internal administration policies and deliberations. And some of the returns that Democrats are seeking are from before Trump was even president. And perhaps that's why Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has not so far cited executive privilege and invoked it. He has not turned to that yet, and perhaps that's part of the reason why.
All right, the Washington Post, Jeff Stein, thank you very much for your reporting. Now, the tension between House Democrats and the Trump administration is escalating after former White House counsel Don McGahn defied a congressional subpoena to testify before Congress yesterday. There was that empty chair. The House Judiciary Committee has now subpoenaed former White House Communications Director Hope Hicks, along with Annie Donaldson, McGahn's former chief of staff. McGahn had been scheduled to appear before the committee yesterday morning, but he skipped the hearing after being directed by President Trump to ignore the subpoena.
The president took it upon himself to intimidate a witness who has a legal obligation to be here today. This conduct is not remotely acceptable. Let me be clear. This committee will hear Mr. McGahn's testimony, even if we have to go to court to secure it. We will not allow the president to prevent the American people from hearing from this witness.
Bob Bauer, I'd like to get back to tax law for a second. I realize tax law can be very arcane, and every lobbyist in Washington has a semicolon or a clause in tax law that's been written over the past 20 years. But what if this subpoena to the Treasury Department, to the Secretary Treasurer, for 6 years of Donald Trump's taxes. What if it were restricted to end in the year 2016, when he was not an elected official, he was not president of the United States? How could he ever invoke executive privilege when the request was for tax returns from when he was a private citizen?
Again, I'm not sure in what context, with respect to what considerations, on what record the executive privilege would be invoked. I have to say I'm not clear about that at all. I'm not saying it can't be done. There are lawyers who will devote significant amounts of energy, creative and other energy, to devising arguments about how the privilege applies in particular circumstances, and those arguments are going to have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But that underscores the point that Mika made earlier, which is this could turn out to be a protracted legal food fight.
So, Susan, to go back to Don McGahn, the sound that we just set up there with Mika, you had the chairman, Jerry Nadler, saying Don McGahn will testify before this committee one way or another. The White House is daring Democrats to commence impeachment, an inquiry into it. They're saying, we're not going to answer subpoenas. We're going to instruct people not to testify. We're going to invoke executive privilege. We're going to put up that stone wall. What are you going to do about it? If you were a Democrat in a leadership position, Nancy Pelosi's been very careful about the question of impeachment, saying, slow down, let's follow the facts. But some Democrats are getting restless in that caucus now.
They are getting restless, and they should be. It's been over a month since the Mueller report became public. And at this point, I think it falls upon the Democrats to do something about it. If they feel that there are reasons to impeach the president, if there's things, especially in the second part of that report, that are impeachable offenses, go do it. And I say this as a Republican who called on other Republicans in the Senate to do the right thing and vote against the president and not authorize the emergency action in the for the Board of Security about a month ago. They have to go do their job, and they are frustrated. This, just as we heard, it could take months or years. They should be acting now.
There's got to be a mechanism for more real-time oversight and accountability.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.